Sir, if you can't maintain the minimum balance, maybe you should try the check cashing place across the street. The young teller's voice carried farther than she intended, sharp enough to cut through the quiet marble lobby of Sterling National Bank. A few people glanced up from their phones. One man near the coffee station smirked. Another woman tightened her grip on her designer handbag as if the tired-looking single father standing at the counter might somehow contaminate the polished air around her. Caleb Mercer didn't respond right away. He simply rested one rough hand on the counter while the other held the small fingers of his 9-year-old daughter. Sophie stood quietly beside him in a faded yellow sweater, her backpack hanging crooked over one shoulder, her wide blue eyes moving nervously between the teller and her father. Outside, cold November rain streaked down the glass windows of downtown Chicago, turning the street silver beneath the gray morning sky. Inside the bank, everything gleamed. Marble floors. Brass railings. Crystal light fixtures suspended high above like frozen stars. Caleb looked painfully out of place there. His boots carried traces of engine grease. His dark green jacket was worn thin at the elbows. There was exhaustion in his face, the kind that came from years of carrying grief quietly without asking anyone for help. But his eyes remained calm. Steady. "I'm not here to withdraw money," Caleb said softly. "I'm here to reopen a legacy account." The teller blinked once, then gave a polite smile that didn't hide the mockery underneath. "Sir, dormant legacy accounts require executive authorization." "I understand. Do you have the account number?" Caleb carefully reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded an old piece of paper softened by time. Sophie looked up at him. "Daddy, is this Mom's account?" she whispered gently. Caleb nodded once. Something flickered across his face then disappeared before anyone else noticed. The teller typed the numbers lazily into her terminal, clearly expecting nothing. But suddenly her expression changed. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. The color drained from her face as a red notification appeared on the screen. Executive legacy account detected. Restricted access only. For a moment, the only sound in the bank was the low hum of fluorescent lights and rain tapping against the windows. Then another alert flashed across her monitor. Account value, $8,247,113.42. The teller swallowed hard. "Wait, what?" she whispered under her breath. Caleb lowered his eyes slightly, almost uncomfortable with the attention. Sophie squeezed his hand tighter. Around them, the mood inside the bank shifted like air before a storm. The manager behind the glass office looked up immediately. Two employees exchanged stunned glances. And from the second-floor balcony overlooking the lobby, a woman in a charcoal-gray designer suit slowly stopped walking. Vivian Sterling had been heading toward a board meeting when she heard the silence below. At 36, the CEO of Sterling National carried herself with effortless authority, every step precise, every glance sharp enough to command a room. But now her attention locked onto the quiet single father standing at counter 7. Because she recognized the account code on the monitor instantly. Only 3 people in the history of Sterling National had ever been granted founder legacy clearance. One was dead. One vanished almost a decade ago. And the third man was standing downstairs wearing a weathered jacket beside a little girl holding his hand like he was the safest place left in the world. If you enjoy thoughtful stories with real emotion, please subscribe and support the channel. We truly appreciate it. And for those watching, have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? Share your story in the comments. Now, let's get back to the story. The silence inside Sterling National did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like thin ice beneath too much weight. The young teller stared at the glowing numbers on her monitor as though the screen itself had betrayed her. $8 million. Not in stocks. Not pending. Liquid and protected under one of the oldest legacy structures in the institution's history. Caleb Mercer stood there quietly while whispers began moving through the lobby in cautious little waves. Some customers suddenly avoided looking at him altogether. Others looked too hard now, trying to understand how a man with worn boots and tired eyes could belong to a number that large. Sophie tugged gently on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "are we in trouble?" Caleb looked down at her, and the hardness in his face softened instantly. "No, sweetheart," he said calmly. "We are okay." His voice carried the kind of steadiness that only came from years of surviving difficult things without complaint. Upstairs, Vivian Sterling remained motionless near the balcony railing. The rain outside reflected faintly across the glass behind her, casting silver light across her sharp features. She had spent most of her adult life around powerful men. Investors. Politicians. Hedge fund executives who measured human value in quarterly reports and tailored suits. But the man downstairs did not carry himself like someone impressed by money. That unsettled her more than the account itself. "Miss Sterling," one of her assistants asked carefully beside her. "Should I call security?" Vivian kept her eyes on Caleb. "No," she answered quietly. "Bring me everything we have on that account." Down below, the branch manager hurried out from his office with sudden nervous energy replacing the confidence he wore earlier. His expensive shoes clicked quickly across the marble floor. "Mr. Mercer," he said, forcing a smile that appeared almost painful now. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Caleb nodded politely but did not smile back. "I only came to reopen the account," he replied. "My daughter's school tuition is due next month." The manager blinked, confused for half a second. $8 million sitting untouched for years, and the man was worried about a school payment. That was when the room truly began to change. Not because of the money. Because of the restraint. Because wealth usually arrived loudly. Caleb Mercer wore his quietly like grief. Sophie looked around the giant lobby with nervous curiosity. "Daddy," she whispered again, "Mom used to come here, right?" Caleb inhaled slowly. The memory hit him harder than he expected. His late wife, Amelia, standing beneath those same chandeliers years earlier, laughing softly while holding Sophie as a baby. Back when Caleb still wore pressed suits instead of oil-stained jackets. Back when people returned his phone calls within minutes. Back before hospital rooms replaced boardrooms. "Yes," he answered gently. "Your mom loved this bank." Sophie smiled faintly. "Because of the shiny floors?" Caleb almost laughed. "No," he said quietly. "Because she believed people could do good things with money if they stayed kind." Those words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Even the teller lowered her eyes. And above them, Vivian Sterling felt something uncomfortable move through her chest. Because her father used to say the exact opposite. Money was control. Money was leverage. Money was survival. Kindness had never entered the equation. Yet the quiet widower downstairs somehow carried more dignity in his worn jacket than most executives she had met in the last decade. Vivian turned toward the elevator at last. "Clear my schedule," she said softly. "I want to meet Mr. Mercer personally." And for the first time in years, the most powerful woman in Sterling National felt strangely nervous about shaking someone's hand. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that barely carried across the enormous lobby, but somehow every employee inside Sterling National noticed the moment Vivian Sterling stepped onto the marble floor. Conversations faded instantly. Phones lowered. Even the branch manager straightened his tie like a schoolboy preparing for inspection. Vivian walked calmly through the center of the bank in black heels that echoed softly against the polished stone. Her charcoal gray coat moved elegantly behind her, tailored perfectly, expensive without trying too hard. But it was her expression that unsettled people most. She was not angry. She was focused. And inside Sterling National, that was far more dangerous. Caleb Mercer looked up as she approached. Their eyes met for the first time fully, without distance or interruption. Vivian expected nervousness. Most people became visibly uncomfortable around her within seconds. Caleb did not. He simply stood there beside his daughter with the same quiet steadiness he had carried since entering the bank. Sophie looked up at the elegant woman curiously. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "is she famous?" Vivian almost smiled despite herself. Caleb glanced down gently. "Something like that." Vivian stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was smooth and controlled, shaped by years of boardrooms and negotiations. "I am Vivian Sterling." Caleb nodded once. "I figured." The branch manager forced a nervous laugh that nobody joined. Vivian ignored him completely. Her attention remained fixed on Caleb and the folded paper still resting beside the terminal. "May we speak privately?" she asked. Caleb looked at Sophie. "Would that be okay with you, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded politely, though her small fingers tightened slightly around his sleeve. Vivian noticed that immediately. She noticed everything. The child trusted her father completely. Not out of fear. Out of safety. It stirred something unfamiliar inside her. She led them toward a private executive office overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the rainy skyline while soft jazz drifted quietly from hidden speakers overhead. Caleb stepped inside carefully, almost like a man entering a life he no longer belonged to. Sophie wandered toward the glass slowly, staring at the tiny cars moving below like toy lights in the rain. Vivian closed the office door behind them. Silence settled briefly. Then she turned toward Caleb. "Your account has not been touched in nearly 11 years, she said carefully. "Most people with that level of wealth would not disappear the way you did." Caleb lowered his eyes for a moment. "Most people did not bury their wife at 31. The words landed softly but heavily. Vivian felt them immediately. Caleb did not say them for pity. He said them because they were true. Nothing more. Sophie remained near the window quietly drawing shapes into the fogged glass with her fingertip. Vivian moved slower now, her sharp executive rhythm fading into something more human. "I knew your wife's name," she admitted quietly. "Amelia Mercer." Caleb looked surprised for the first time all morning. Vivian walked toward the bookshelf near her desk. "My father spoke about her once," she said. "He said she was one of the kindest people ever to walk through this building." Caleb's face softened painfully at the mention of her. "She believed people deserved second chances," he murmured. Vivian leaned lightly against the edge of her desk, studying him carefully now. "And you?" she asked softly. "What did you believe?" Caleb looked through the rain-streaked windows toward the gray city beyond. For a moment, he seemed older than 42. Not physically. Spiritually. Like life had sanded away every unnecessary piece of him until only truth remained. "I believed money could solve everything," he answered quietly. "Then my wife got sick." The room fell silent again. Not awkward silence. The kind that arrives when pain has finally stopped pretending to be small. Vivian looked at the man sitting across from her and realized something unsettling. Caleb Mercer was not hiding wealth. He was hiding heartbreak. And somehow that made him far more dangerous than any billionaire she had ever met. Rain continued sliding down the massive windows behind them, turning the Chicago skyline into a blur of silver and gray while the executive office grew strangely quiet. Vivian Sterling stood near her desk with one hand lightly resting against the polished walnut surface, watching Caleb Mercer carefully now, no longer as a banker studying a client, but as a woman trying to understand a man who had somehow stepped out of another world entirely. Sophie sat curled into one of the leather chairs near the window, quietly flipping through a small sketchbook from her backpack. Every few seconds she glanced toward her father, making sure he was still there. Caleb noticed every time. He always noticed. Vivian finally broke the silence. "There is something I still do not understand," she said softly. "If the account holds this much money, why have you been living the way you do? Caleb looked down at his rough hands for a moment. Oil stains still clung faintly beneath his fingernails despite the careful scrubbing before coming to the bank. Because most of it was never mine, he answered calmly. Vivian frowned slightly. The account is under your name. Legally, yes. He exhaled slowly. But emotionally, it belonged to Amelia. The room seemed to slow around his words. Caleb reached into his jacket again and removed an old photograph folded carefully at the edges from years of being carried close. He handed it to Vivian gently. The picture showed a younger Caleb standing beside a smiling blonde woman beneath autumn trees, both of them laughing while holding a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Sophie leaned over from her chair immediately. That was my first trip to Vermont, she said proudly. Vivian stared at the photograph longer than she expected. Amelia Mercer had warm eyes. The kind that made people feel safe instantly. She was beautiful, Vivian said quietly before she could stop herself. Caleb nodded once. She made every room feel softer. Vivian handed the picture back carefully, almost respectfully. So where did the money come from? Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair. Years ago, before Amelia got sick, I developed a predictive financial model for market stability. Vivian's expression sharpened instantly. You built a trading algorithm? Caleb nodded. A risk-balancing framework. It prevented panic sell-offs during unstable quarters. Vivian blinked slowly. Every executive inside the financial world knew about that system. It had quietly saved billions during a brutal market collapse nearly 12 years earlier. But the creator's identity had vanished before the launch became public. That was you? She asked carefully. Caleb looked almost uncomfortable discussing it. It was supposed to become something bigger, he admitted. Then Amelia's diagnosis came. The rain outside tapped softly against the windows while Sophie continued sketching quietly nearby, unaware she was sitting between two people whose lives were beginning to shift forever. Caleb's voice lowered. The hospitals. The treatments. The traveling. None of it worked. Vivian said nothing. She simply listened now. Truly listened. After she passed, Caleb continued softly, I could not look at the money the same way anymore. Every dollar reminded me of another machine, another doctor, another moment I thought I could buy more time. The pain in his voice remained controlled, but that somehow made it heavier. Vivian felt something tighten painfully in her chest. She had spent years around people obsessed with becoming rich. Caleb Mercer sounded like a man exhausted by surviving it. So you left? She asked gently. Caleb nodded. I sold everything except the legacy account. Why keep it? For the first time that morning, Caleb smiled fully, though sadness still lived underneath it. He looked toward Sophie. Because Amelia made me promise that one day our daughter would never have to choose between her dreams and survival. Sophie looked up then, catching her father smiling at her. She smiled back instantly, pure and trusting. And something inside Vivian Sterling shifted quietly in that moment. Because she suddenly realized the $8 million sitting inside Sterling National was not a fortune. It was a love letter from a grieving husband who had spent 11 years protecting his daughter from the kind of pain money could never fix. By early afternoon, the rain outside Sterling National had slowed into a cold mist that blurred the city streets below, but inside the bank, tension moved faster than the weather. Employees whispered behind computer screens. Managers checked their phones every few minutes. Somewhere on the lower floor, someone had already uploaded a short video of the morning incident online. A tired single father standing quietly at a bank counter while an employee mocked him in front of strangers. The clip lasted less than 40 seconds, but people were already sharing it by the thousands. The comments came quickly. This is how banks treat working people. Look at the little girl beside him. The man stayed calmer than everyone else in that room. Vivian Sterling stood beside the long conference table in her executive office, reading the flood of messages appearing across her tablet. Her jaw tightened slightly with every swipe. Across from her, the regional director of public relations cleared his throat nervously. The story is gaining traction faster than expected, he admitted. Several financial blogs already picked it up. Vivian did not look up. And the employee involved? The teller has been suspended pending review. That is not what I asked. The room fell quiet immediately. Vivian finally lifted her eyes, calm but sharp. How many customer complaints has this branch ignored over the last 3 years? Nobody answered right away. That silence told her enough. Across the office, Caleb sat near the windows while Sophie colored quietly beside him at the far end of the table using pencils someone from accounting had brought upstairs. He looked strangely detached from the chaos surrounding him, like a man who had already survived harder things than embarrassment. Vivian noticed that too. Most people would have been angry by now. Demanding apologies. Threatening lawsuits. Caleb Mercer only seemed tired. Mr. Mercer, the public relations director began carefully, turning toward him, Sterling National would like to formally apologize for the disrespect you experienced this morning. Caleb gave a small nod. Thank you. The director blinked awkwardly. He had expected more. Vivian stepped in quietly. That is all, she asked Caleb. You are not upset. Caleb leaned back slightly in the chair. Being looked down on stopped surprising me a long time ago. The simplicity of the answer landed harder than anger would have. Sophie looked up briefly from her drawing. Daddy says people who hurt others are usually hurting inside too. The adults in the room went still. Vivian glanced toward the little girl. Does he? Sophie nodded seriously. Mom used to say that kindness is hardest when people least deserve it. Caleb lowered his eyes for a moment after hearing Amelia mentioned again. Vivian watched the pain move across his face like a shadow passing over water. Quiet. Controlled. Still alive. One of the younger executives suddenly entered the office holding a phone. Miss Sterling, he said nervously, there is another problem. Vivian accepted the device. Her expression hardened immediately. Another video had surfaced. This one showed the branch manager earlier that morning laughing while security approached Caleb and Sophie near the front. Counter. Sophie's small voice could be heard clearly in the clip. Daddy, did we do something wrong? The internet responded instantly. Millions of views within hours. Parents. Veterans. Teachers. Working families. People were not reacting to the money anymore. They were reacting to dignity. To a little girl standing beside a father who refused to lose his composure while strangers humiliated him publicly. Vivian slowly lowered the phone. The office remained silent except for the faint jazz music drifting overhead and the sound of Sophie's crayons moving softly across paper. Then Caleb spoke quietly from beside the windows. You know the strange part? Everyone looked toward him. He stared out at the gray skyline while speaking almost to himself. 10 years ago, I probably would have reacted exactly like your employees did. Vivian frowned slightly. What changed? Caleb looked toward Sophie. His daughter smiled proudly as she held up her drawing of 3 people standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Her, he answered softly. And for reasons she could not fully explain yet, Vivian Sterling suddenly felt ashamed of a world that taught men to become successful before teaching them how to become gentle. The storm outside finally passed just before sunset, leaving the windows of Sterling National washed clean in pale amber light. Downtown Chicago glowed softly beneath the early evening sky while most employees downstairs moved through the building with unusual quietness, as though the entire bank had become aware that something important had shifted inside its walls that day. In the executive office, the tension from earlier had faded into something slower and more human. The public relations team had left. The lawyers had stopped talking. Even the endless ringing phones outside seemed more distant now. Sophie sat cross-legged near the corner of the office beside a tall indoor piano polished black beneath the warm lights. "You have a piano," she said softly, almost surprised. Vivian looked over from her desk. "My father bought it years ago," she answered. "Nobody really plays it." Sophie ran her fingers lightly across the keys without pressing them fully. "My mom used to play every night." Caleb smiled faintly from his chair near the windows. "She was better than me." Sophie looked back immediately. "Daddy, you are good too." Caleb chuckled quietly under his breath. "I know about 4 songs." "5, Sophie corrected proudly. Vivian watched the exchange carefully. The softness between them felt unfamiliar in a room normally filled with contracts and negotiations. Sophie slowly climbed onto the piano bench. "Can I?" she asked politely. Vivian nodded. "Of course." The little girl pressed one careful note first. Then another. A simple melody drifted into the office, gentle and uncertain at first like footsteps testing old memories. Caleb lowered his eyes as soon as he recognized the song. Amelia used to hum it while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. Vivian noticed the change in his expression instantly. Grief moved through him quietly, but it was always there beneath the surface, waiting for small things to wake it up again. Sophie continued playing slowly, her small fingers moving with concentration across the worn ivory keys. The melody carried softly beyond the office walls into the executive hallway outside. Employees passing by slowed without realizing it. Conversations faded. Even downstairs in the lobby, several customers glanced upward toward the faint music drifting through the building. Vivian remained perfectly still beside her desk. She could not remember the last time Sterling National sounded peaceful. Sophie missed a note suddenly and frowned. "Oops." Caleb smiled gently. "Your mom used to miss that same part too." Sophie giggled softly. "Really?" "Every single time." The little girl played again from the beginning, slower now. More careful. Vivian watched Caleb as much as she listened to the music. There was no performance in him. No arrogance. No need to impress anyone in the room. Just a father holding together a life built from loss and love one quiet day at a time. It unsettled her more deeply than she wanted to admit. Her entire world had always rewarded confidence, ambition, control. Caleb Mercer carried none of those things loudly, yet somehow his presence made everyone around him softer. More honest. Sophie finished the song at last and looked up nervously. "Was it okay?" she asked. For a moment nobody answered. The office remained suspended in stillness while the final piano note faded into the golden evening light. Then Vivian spoke quietly. "That was the most beautiful thing this building has heard in years." Sophie beamed instantly. Caleb looked down, almost embarrassed by the emotion in the room. Vivian turned toward the city windows slowly. Memories she usually kept buried began surfacing without permission. Long dinners where nobody spoke. Penthouse silence. Nannies instead of parents. A father who gave her everything except warmth. She had spent most of her adult life believing success meant becoming untouchable. But sitting here now, listening to a little girl play piano beside a grieving father who still chose kindness after losing almost everything, Vivian felt something painful begin to crack open inside her. Because for the first time in years, she realized wealth without tenderness was just another form of poverty. And somewhere deep inside Sterling National, beneath the marble floors and billion-dollar accounts, a lonely woman quietly began remembering what it felt like to admire someone for reasons money could never buy. Long after most employees had gone home for the evening, the upper floors of Sterling National remained dimly lit beneath the quiet glow of desk lamps and city lights. Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the windows like a river of gold and silver beneath the night sky. Downstairs, janitors moved silently across the marble lobby while the last elevators hummed softly through the building. But inside her private office, Vivian Sterling sat alone at her desk, unable to stop thinking about Caleb Mercer. His voice. His restraint. The way he spoke about love as if it mattered more than money even after life had taken so much from him. It unsettled her deeply. Vivian opened the old digital archive her father had left behind after his death 3 years earlier. Thousands of financial reports, recordings, investment files, handwritten notes. Most of them she had never bothered reading closely before. Her relationship with her father had been complicated at best. Respect without warmth. Loyalty without closeness. She typed Caleb Mercer's name into the search bar almost absent-mindedly. At first, only standard records appeared. Account structures. Legacy trust documents. Internal banking approvals. Then something else surfaced. A restricted folder marked Private Executive Review. Created 11 years ago by Charles Sterling himself. Vivian frowned slightly and clicked it open. Inside sat a recorded memo dated only 6 months before Amelia Mercer died. Her father's face appeared on the screen, older than Vivian remembered him, tired around the eyes but unusually sincere. If this file is ever opened, he began quietly, then either Caleb Mercer has returned, or I am already gone. Vivian sat forward slowly. Her father continued. 10 years ago, Sterling National stood 12 days away from collapse during the market panic. Most of our senior analysts failed to stop the downward projections. But one man did. Vivian felt her heartbeat slow. Caleb Mercer developed the stabilization model that saved this institution from destruction. Not because he wanted power. Not because he wanted publicity. Because he believed ordinary families should not lose their homes while wealthy executives protected themselves. Vivian stared silently at the screen. Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the lake. Her father lowered his eyes briefly in the recording. I offered him a partnership. A seat on the board. More money than any young analyst his age had ever seen. He paused. He refused all of it. Vivian blinked slowly. That alone made no sense in the financial world she knew. But the next sentence hit even harder. The day Amelia was diagnosed, her father continued quietly, Caleb walked into my office and resigned without negotiating a single dollar more for himself. His only request was that the future royalties from his model be placed into a protected trust for his wife and daughter. Vivian felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. The screen flickered softly while her father leaned closer to the camera. There are men who become wealthy because they chase money. Caleb Mercer became valuable because he never did. Silence filled the office after the recording ended. Vivian remained frozen in her chair staring at the dark monitor. For years she had admired ruthless ambition because it was all she had ever been taught to respect. Yet the man downstairs repairing machines in grease-stained jackets had once quietly saved her family's empire and walked away from it without demanding recognition. Her phone suddenly buzzed against the desk. A message from one of the board members appeared on the screen. We should pressure Mercer into selling his legacy position before the media situation worsens. Vivian stared at the text for a long moment. Then she slowly locked the phone without replying. Across the office, Sophie's forgotten drawing still rested near the piano from earlier that evening. 3 stick figures beneath a bright yellow sun. One taller than the others holding both their hands. Vivian walked toward it slowly and picked it up carefully. At the bottom, written in uneven pencil letters, were 4 simple words. My daddy keeps us safe. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. And somewhere deep beneath years of polished control and executive armor, the lonely little girl she used to be quietly wondered what life might have felt like growing up with a father like Caleb Mercer. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling National had always been designed to intimidate. Walls of dark walnut. A table long enough to seat 20 executives comfortably. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago like a kingdom of glass and steel beneath the cold morning sky. Usually the room carried the low confidence of people accustomed to controlling outcomes before conversations even began. But this morning felt different. The atmosphere inside the boardroom was tight. Careful. Almost uneasy. Caleb Mercer sat quietly near the far end of the table wearing the same dark green jacket he had arrived in the day before. Beside him rested a simple folder containing documents for Sophie's trust account. Nothing more. Across from him, board members shifted uncomfortably in expensive suits while legal advisors whispered behind tablets and financial reports. Vivian Sterling entered last. The room immediately stood. She acknowledged nobody right away, her expression calm but unreadable as she moved toward the head of the table. The city lights reflected softly across the polished surface beneath her hands. "Let us begin," she said quietly. One of the senior board members, Gerald Whitmore, cleared his throat first. 70 years old, silver-haired, perfectly tailored, he carried himself like a man who still believed wealth and wisdom were the same thing. "Mr. Mercer," he began smoothly, "first let me say Sterling National appreciates your historical contributions to this institution." Caleb nodded politely. "Thank you." Gerald folded his hands. "Given the unfortunate media attention surrounding your account, the board believes it may be wise to negotiate a private buyout of your legacy holdings." Silence followed. Vivian watched Caleb carefully. Most people in that chair would have leaned forward immediately. Asked for numbers. Power. Advantage. Caleb simply looked out toward the skyline for a moment before speaking. "You want me to disappear quietly?" Gerald forced a small smile. "We want to protect the bank's stability." Caleb nodded slowly as if considering it honestly. "And how much is dignity worth these days?" Nobody answered. One younger executive attempted to step in quickly. "This is not personal, Mr. Mercer. These situations require strategic handling." Caleb turned toward him calmly. "My daughter was humiliated in your lobby yesterday." The executive lowered his eyes immediately. Caleb's voice never rose. That somehow made every word heavier. "She stood there believing she had done something wrong because adults in expensive clothes decided we looked poor enough to disrespect." The room grew still. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly over Chicago, soft white streaks drifting past the enormous windows. Vivian watched the board members carefully now. Some uncomfortable. Some ashamed. Others simply impatient for the problem to disappear. Gerald adjusted his cufflinks. "We are prepared to offer a generous settlement." Caleb looked at him fully for the first time. "You still think I came here for money?" Another silence. Longer now. Vivian felt it moving through the room like slow thunder. Caleb opened the folder beside him carefully and slid one single document across the table. Sophie Mercer Educational Trust. Established 11 years earlier. Protected until her 18th birthday. "I never touched the account," Caleb said quietly. "Not for hospitals. Not for debt. Not after Amelia died. Even the legal team stopped writing notes." Caleb rested his rough hands gently on the table. "I came back because my daughter deserves the future her mother wanted for her." No anger. No speech. Just truth. And somehow truth sounded louder than power inside that room. Vivian looked down briefly, her throat tightening unexpectedly. Around the table, nobody moved anymore. The polished confidence that normally ruled Sterling National had disappeared completely. Because sitting among billion-dollar executives was a man who had quietly protected his daughter's future for 11 years while asking nothing from anyone in return. Gerald finally looked away first. One by one, the others followed. And for the second time in less than 24 hours, silence settled across Sterling National so completely that the sound of snow tapping gently against the windows suddenly felt louder than every voice in the room. 6 months later, the old church on Maple Street no longer looked abandoned. Warm light spilled through newly restored windows onto fresh snow lining the sidewalks of the small Chicago neighborhood. Laughter drifted through the crisp December air while families gathered beneath a wooden sign that read Mercer Music House. Children carrying violins and sheet music hurried through the front doors with red cheeks and mitten-covered hands. Inside, the scent of pine wood and cinnamon floated through the softly lit halls where old classrooms had been transformed into music studios for children who could not afford lessons anywhere else. Caleb Mercer stood quietly near the entrance adjusting rows of donated winter coats beside the door. He still wore simple clothes. Still drove the same old pickup truck. Still looked more like a mechanic than the quiet owner of one of the largest private trusts connected to Sterling National. But there was something different in him now. The heaviness in his eyes had softened slightly, as if purpose had finally made room beside grief. Across the room, Sophie sat at the grand piano near the stage surrounded by children tuning instruments nervously for the opening recital. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly while she pressed the keys softly one at a time, helping younger students find their notes. "Easy," she whispered to a little boy gripping a violin too tightly. "Music is supposed to feel safe." Caleb overheard her and smiled to himself. Amelia used to say the exact same thing. The doors near the back entrance opened quietly then. Vivian Sterling stepped inside carrying a tray of hot chocolate cups from the cafe across the street. She paused for a moment taking in the scene before her. The sound of children laughing. Volunteers decorating a Christmas tree near the stage. Elderly neighbors hanging paper snowflakes beside framed photographs of former students already accepted into youth music programs. None of it looked expensive. None of it looked powerful. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than every corporate gala Vivian had attended in the last 10 years combined. Caleb noticed her standing there and walked over calmly. "You made it." Vivian handed him one of the cups. "You sounded surprised on the phone." Caleb smiled faintly. "You are usually in New York on Fridays." "Not anymore." Their eyes met briefly. Quietly. Naturally. Nothing forced. Over the past months, Vivian had begun visiting more often. Sometimes bringing supplies. Sometimes helping organize grants anonymously. Sometimes simply sitting in the back of music classes listening to children play badly and joyfully at the same time. Sterling National had publicly apologized after the incident months earlier. Several employees were dismissed. Policies changed. Scholarships created. But Vivian knew none of those things mattered as much as the lesson Caleb Mercer had unknowingly taught everyone who crossed his path. Wealth was not measured by how much someone controlled. It was measured by how gently they carried other people through difficult seasons of life. Sophie suddenly waved excitedly from the piano. "Daddy, we are ready." The room slowly quieted as folding chairs filled with families and neighbors. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while warm golden light wrapped around the old church like memory itself. Caleb moved toward the front row beside Vivian. Children adjusted instruments nervously on stage. Sophie looked out across the crowd and smiled. Then the music began. Soft piano first. Then violins joining carefully one by one. The melody rose gently through the building carrying something larger than performance. Healing. Second chances. Grace. Vivian sat beside Caleb listening quietly while the children played beneath strings of white Christmas lights overhead. After a long moment, she leaned closer slightly. "Your wife would have loved this place." Caleb looked toward the stage where Sophie played with calm confidence beyond her years. His eyes grew damp but peaceful. "I think," he said softly, "she never really left it." Vivian looked at him then, truly looked at him, and finally understood something her father never had. Some men become rich quietly. Others make the world richer simply by remaining kind after life gives them every reason not to be. And as the final piano note faded into the warm December air, silence settled across Mercer Music House once more. Not empty silence. Grateful silence. The kind that only appears when wounded hearts finally begin finding their way home. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more emotional stories like this. And before you go, what state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. See you in the next story.